So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. It's great to have you along. We're going to jump straight into it. I'm going to hand over to Cornelius Williams, the Associate Director of Child Protection at UNICEF, to open today's webinar. Thanks, Cornelius.
Yeah, good morning, colleagues. I can see the participants coming into the room. So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the globe. As Vijay said, my name is Cornelius Williams. I'm the Associate Director of Child Protection for UNICEF. I want to welcome you all to the inaugural webinar of our Access to Justice in the Era of COVID-19 series. Today is especially exciting for me, being a practitioner for over 3 decades, because we are launching 2 publications on UNICEF's experience and lesson learned from the field. And you would get to see why I'm excited today. As we're all too aware, this past year we saw an unprecedented unprecedented challenges, but also notable progress as we adapted to new ways of working, rising to meet the needs of children amid a global pandemic. One area that was significantly affected was children's access to justice. For our work on this critical issue area, the pandemic presented us with an opportunity to support countries to achieve stronger results, especially for children in detention and children's access to justice. This in turn offered us a chance to reinvigorate our justice program, and you will see why I'm excited today with the reinvigorating of this program. Reimagine what it could look like and how we could reach more children than ever before. Building on existing momentum of repositioning children's access to justice at UNICEF global level, we'll be launching a Reimagine Justice agenda in the coming months. But for today, we're just kicking off the series with a brief on the impact on justice we have seen through an analysis of the data from UNICEF's Socio-Economic Impact Survey of COVID-19 response. 2, followed by the launch of a comprehensive field note and learning brief, which document how UNICEF and its partners rapidly adapted its program on access to justice for children to meet the challenges of the pandemic and its unique impact on children in the justice system. The impact on children in the justice system was different from children generally worldwide. And the fourth one actually would be followed, the third one would be followed by the launch of a case study from UNICEF's Europe Central Asia, looking at the use of the interagency technical note on children deprived of their liberty in COVID-19. We hope that this publication will serve as a valuable resource going forward, and we're excited to continue collaboration with everyone in the future. And with that, it's my pleasure to officially launch the Access to Justice for Children in the Era of COVID-19, Notes from the Field and Learning from the Field. One final note, I sincerely apologize in advance as I'll have to hop off the call a bit earlier, which was not my intention due to a conflict in engagement, but I have several colleagues here, and most notably my colleague Christian Di Martino will continue to represent me. Now I'll have to pass on to Claudia Kappa.
Thank you so much, Cornelius. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to present to you today the results of the Socioeconomic Impact Survey that was conducted by UNICEF through our network of country offices. The results of the survey were published in a resource that you can see the cover here that is available on UNICEF website. This survey was sent out to our 157 country office, which include 138 low and middle income countries, as well as 19 high income countries. The survey was conducted in the third quarter of 2020 and asked about disruption in different child protection services, including disruption in the availability and access to legal and judicial processes, procedures or services for children in contact with the law, and processes, procedure, or services for release or entry of children in detention. As of 30th of October 2020, 143 country offices provided responses on questions pertaining to justice for children, and the results that the survey are presented today and reflect the situation in 95% of UNICEF program countries, which are home to approximately 2 billion children. In the next slide, you will see the summary of the data coverage. So we have 143 countries that provided answer out of 157, with a very high response rate of above 90%, with solid response rate throughout the different regions. So the results that I'm presenting today are representative of 95% of the population of children living in these 157 countries and 85% of the overall population of children in the world. And this is what the results are telling us when it comes to services related to justice for children. In the next slide, we can see already the distribution of countries and worldwide when it comes to whether or not these countries have reported a change in coverage of legal and judicial processes, procedures, or services for children in contact with the law. And as you can see from the total bar, you have about 31% of countries that reported a drop in coverage, but more significantly, you have 43% of countries that reported no change or possibly an increase, as it is indicated in the light red, in coverage of legal judicial processes, procedures, and services for children in contact with the law, with some regional variation. And you can see, for instance, in the case of East Asia and the Pacific, you have a significant proportion of countries, 70%, that reported no change in this type of processes, procedure, or services. Now, going to the next slide, these figures present the percentage distribution of countries by whether or not they have reported a change in the coverage of processes, procedures, or services for release or entry into detention. And again, the results are presented for the world as well as disaggregated by region. And as you can see from this graph, 1/3 of countries reported no change in the coverage of services related to detention. So essentially this 34% that you see in yellow, this is the proportion of countries that reported no change in coverage of services related to detention. And of course, there is again a significant variation across region. You see that in the case of Europe, and Central Asia, you have about 67 or 2 out of 3 countries that reported no changes in services related to detention. Another question that we ask and is displayed in the next slide has to do with releasing children from detention since the beginning of the pandemic. And here you have, again, the percentage distribution of countries that reported on services related to justice for children by whether the government had released children from detention since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, as you can see in the bar that represent the world or the total of the region, in nearly half of countries, governments have released children from detention since the beginning of the pandemic, and these levels are particularly high in the case of Western Central Africa, South Asia, Eastern and Southern Africa, Middle East and North Africa, where more than 50% of countries reported having released children from detention since the beginning of the pandemic. And lastly, the last slide that I want to show has to do with alternatives to detentions, whether or not countries adopted such alternative. So again, this graph shows you the total and the value by region. in terms of the percentage distribution of country that reported on service related to justice by whether the government had put in place alternative to detention since the beginning of the pandemic. And as you can see from the total bar, nearly half of countries that the government has not put in place alternative to detention in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, there is significant variation as well. There are levels going in terms of no measure going from 20% in East Asia and the Pacific all the way to 67% in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm going to stop here to give the floor to my colleagues, but of course I will be happy to answer any question you might have on this data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. We're now going to move on to the first publication, which is the Access to Justice for Children in the Era of COVID-19, Notes from the Field. And that will be presented by Bruce Grant. Bruce is an international child protection advisor and consultant based in Sydney, Australia. As a retired staff member of UNICEF, he has served as the Chief of Child Protection in development and humanitarian context in which UNICEF works. His work on justice for children is extensive. Prior to joining UNICEF, he was a policy coordinator for the New South Wales Government Department of Juvenile Justice. And in 2002, he was awarded an Churchill Fellowship to travel to the UK, the US, and Canada to conduct comparative analysis research on best practice programs in juvenile justice. Last year, he founded Child Protection in International Development, a website for sharing resources and generating and promoting new knowledge in child protection in international development. So over to you, Bruce.
BJ, thank you for that warm introduction, and Claudia, thank you for your presentation. It was really, really informative. Hello, everyone. So my job today is to talk you through the first of two reports, and in a sense, the two reports need to be read together. The first report is Access to Justice for Children in the Era of COVID-19, Notes from the Field. Next slide, please. So why does this matter? Well, I think for all of you here today in this webinar, you understand why it matters, but it's important just to retouch on the key matters. As we know, the right to personal liberty is one of the most enduring and important of all human rights. Yet one study estimates that every year more than 400,000 children worldwide are held in juvenile detention facilities and prisons. Yet in 2021, we still do not know the actual number of children detained, let alone have disaggregated data on gender, age, ethnicity, race, disability, etc. So if we don't know the number of children in detention, we really don't know the number of children who have been released from detention. And I suppose for those of us working in the area of justice for children in international development, one of the biggest bottlenecks we have globally is just this lack of data. Data that tells us who these children are, why the children are in there, what happens to children while they're in there, and what are the pathways to getting children out and to stop juvenile reoffending. The second key point is that releasing girls and boys from detention is a public health priority, as you know, and a key prevention measure for COVID, for the simple reason that the pandemic spreads much more rapidly in confined spaces. New variants of the virus are proving much more infectious and are infecting younger adults and children at higher levels than previous mutations. As we know, we're in the middle of this pandemic, we're not at the end of it, and the humanitarian imperative, as well as the human rights imperative of getting children out of detention, remains as strong today as it did at the onset of the pandemic. And as a final note, vaccines might provide a bridge to a world for some countries and some people, to a world to a post-COVID-19 world. But in the meantime, prevention remains a priority. This means keeping children out of high-risk environments such as detention facilities. Next slide, please. Okay, what I want to do now is just briefly talk you through the purpose and scope of this rapid analysis. The purpose of the rapid analysis is to document how UNICEF Access for Justice for Children work is adapting to meet the challenges of COVID-19. It sought to identify and understand answers to 3 questions. And in a sense, the rapid analysis wanted to understand, well, how is this work changing? But equally important, well, what's the results? What are the results from children from this change and how UNICEF is dealing with issues for justice for children? So the first key question was contribution to the result. How was the result achieved, and what was the contribution of UNICEF and partners to the achievement of the result? And clearly a result is the number of children released from detention. The second question was about the enabler for the result. Why was UNICEF able to achieve the result? What were the enablers or critical success factors for the achievement of the result? And thirdly, context. Where does the key result fit within the broader context of the global results achieved by UNICEF? The scope of the analysis was not to review all types of access to justice interventions, but specifically those concerned with children being released from detention as a preventive measure for COVID and steps being taken to keep justice services functioning during lockdowns. Next slide, please. The methodology. The rapid analysis reviewed the knowledge, data and evidence reported by UNICEF headquarters, regional offices and country offices responding to child justice and child protection issues in the context of COVID. It included information extracted from situation reports and indicators, country office annual reporting and other established UNICEF mechanisms and platforms for collecting and analysing data. A key source of data were the COVID-19 situation reports produced by UNICEF headquarters, regional offices and country offices. And thirdly, UNICEF headquarters, regional offices and country office websites were used to gather further information on COVID-related programming and priorities for justice for children. And also the websites provide a very valuable source of information to try and understand what were the enablers, what was enabling countries to achieve results in such a difficult situation as this pandemic. Next slide, please. A big thank you to all the regional and UNICEF country officers for sharing their practices, their innovations and their insights. The field notes, the rapid analysis, highlights key interventions or approaches being implemented by 32 UNICEF country offices, the 7 UNICEF regional offices, and UNICEF headquarters. So again, the scope was not to document all of the work that was being done at the country offices, but really to highlight 1 or 2 interventions were having the most impact in terms of the children at risk of COVID because of being detained in enclosed facilities such as detention facilities. In the next presentation that Vijay is doing, he's got a very good global map that gives a good representation of the countries and their results. So I won't go through the countries now. Next slide, please. Okay, with all studies, there's limitations. I suppose the 2 big limitations for this study was the time frame. So really, the time frame was since the onset of the pandemic back in March through to June 2020. So really, it's a 3.5–4 months window. Work that happened after that has not really been included in the rapid analysis. Secondly, a rapid analysis methodology proposes limitations in terms of the data that can be accessed and how that data can be analysed. It doesn't allow for deeper analysis or primary research. We basically had to work with the information that was available. We couldn't go to generate new knowledge. And because of this, it probably means that we missed some country officers that were doing great work around COVID, who were getting children out of detention. And if you're one of those country officers, then my apologies for that. And as we know, with a rapid analysis, you work with the data that's available at the time, and there's no time to verify that data. So what that means is that data can be changed, modified as new information becomes available, and as country officers have time to do the verification. But where we're confident, because UNICEF has done some post-verification since the rapid analysis, is that the data we have, we're confident the data tells us the minimum number of countries releasing children from detention and the minimum number of children released as a result of those efforts. Also, because countries were really up to their eyeballs in a humanitarian response, there was an opportunity to go back and to interrogate the data. We just worked with what we had. And a related issue is that in countries where there was a good understanding of child protection and justice for children, then the COVID reports, the situational reports on COVID, usually provided good data on what was happening in terms of justice for children and broader child protection. In countries where child protection or justice for children may not have been seen as such a priority in the broader UN or the international development landscape, there wasn't a lot of data, which was a bit of a challenge. Another sort of limitation was really, as we know, COVID is evolving all the time. So at the time we did the rapid analysis, we had countries where COVID was still emerging as an issue. Other countries, where countries were caught up in the first wave, and other countries still where they were dealing with the second wave. So that human rights imperative, the humanitarian imperative to release children from detention, was seen differently in countries based on where they were at in terms of COVID in their country. As an aside, as we all know, quite recently we've learned of new variants of COVID that have emerged. And we know that the initial data says that the new mutations and new variants are more infectious, and they do seem to be impacting more on younger people, including children. So that I suppose provides another opportunity for us to get back in to talk to those governments who are resistant to releasing children first time around, to say, look, the situation is getting worse. We really need to revisit this issue again. Next slide, please. Okay, so the key findings, now sorry for 1 second, I'm trying to reset my clock so I don't go overboard, so just bear with me, right? My clock's back on. Okay, so key findings. UNICEF's call for governments and detaining authorities to place a moratorium on new admissions of children to detention facilities and to urgently release all children who can safely return to their families or an appropriate alternative have been positively received in many countries. In fact, as we know, at least 37 countries are providing for the release of more than 11,000 children through the use of a range of alternative measures to detention, as well as placing a moratorium on new admissions of children into detention. So I suppose the question is, in a global pandemic, is 37 children, 37 countries, is that significant? I think it is. If you think that all the countries in the study are developing countries, when you're talking about 37 countries, you're talking a little more than 1 in 3 developing countries are in the process or have engaged in releasing children from detention, and that's quite significant, and it provides a platform for really looking at how to reinvigorate the global agenda about promoting alternatives to detention, and this is an issue that Vijay will talk more about in his report that's looking at the lessons that have come from this work. So in terms of releasing children from detention, it is a very positive story on a number of levels. So for examples include the Sudan, releasing approximately 85% of children in detention, the West Bank and Gaza in the state of Palestine, 85%, Morocco, 35%, Albania and Indonesia, 50%, and Mozambique, 42%. In Gabon, less than 10 children remain in detention since most have been released as a preventive measure. And that was also a very interesting finding across particular parts of the world, particularly in terms of Europe and Central Asia, where there'd been such a big investment in alternatives to detention that at the time COVID struck, there weren't that many children in detention, and the ones that were there, UNICEF partners were able to work with government fairly efficiently to get many of those children out. Next slide, please. Other key findings are that 5 countries are implementing innovations in their court processes through the introduction of virtual courts to ensure continuation of court services for victims, witness, and alleged juvenile offenders. Excuse me. As we know, in terms of victims and witnesses, survivors of crime, for some time, virtual courts have been in place to ensure that children can give their evidence safely, and often that was involved in on camera. What COVID's done is sped that process up and extended it now to juvenile courts, where we're having in many of these 5 countries almost the whole court process being online, from the case management to the hearing of the cases, to the giving of witnesses, to the giving of evidence. In addition, 9 countries are innovating by moving justice-related training programs from face-to-face learning to online learning. Clearly, this shift was happening prior to COVID. What COVID's done is accelerate it. And clearly, as we know, there's some challenges here. It's like for people to have access to online training, they need to have access to the equipment, they need the literacy skills to be able to operate and learn in the online environment, and they need basic things like access to the internet, which, as we know, these are challenges in many, many countries. Saying that, the upside of all of this is that online training provides the opportunity for larger numbers of people to access the information, to upskill, to get the knowledge, and to apply that knowledge. And also it means to people who are not living in geographical spaces where often face-to-face learning happens, they can access that learning. So again, it's this whole area is accelerating rapidly. Another key finding was that all UNICEF regional offices and many UNICEF country offices are using the interagency technical note COVID-19 and children to provide for their liberty. As many of you will be aware, the development of the note was led by the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action, UNICEF and many other partners, and they did it within lightning speed. And although it was very clear that many countries knew what they need to do in terms of COVID and justice, what the technical note did, it brought a sharpness to the advocacy. So countries could say, this is the global advice, and it also brought a sharpness to the technical advice they're providing as well. So globally, that was a tool that many countries used to progress this agenda in terms of getting children out of detention and to ensure that justice services were delivered. In addition, in several countries, United Nations-wide advocacy approaches are being successfully used in access to justice program, especially the release of children and women from detention. For example, in Cambodia, the UN worked together to focus on women, children, people with disabilities, and for one UN voice in their advocacy with government on this issue. Next slide, please. this is the second last slide. So one of the part of the methodology was to sorry, Erin, can you just go back to the previous slide? Oh, perfect, thank you. Sorry, yes, thank you. That's the enablers for change, thank you. So as part of the methodology, one of the issues we looked at was what were the enablers for change? Why were some country officers able to move fairly rapidly in their engagement with governments to get children out of detention? And there's two enablers, the big picture enablers we identified. The first is UNICEF's long-term investments in strengthening diversion and alternatives to detention. Is a key enabler for the release of children from detention as a preventive measure for COVID-19. So what does that look like? So for example, in Eastern Europe and Europe and Central Asia, there's been decades-long investment in promoting alternatives to detention. So it's a platform to use in advocacy with government and the provision of technical advice to government. The same applied in East Asia, the Pacific, and many other countries. The second key enabler was that trust, expertise, longevity and creativity have positioned UNICEF as a leading voice on child justice and are the key enablers for the results that are being achieved by UNICEF country officers across all regions. Again, what's that look like? If we look at Indonesia, for example, they've been working with the government on juvenile justice reform since 2004. That reform in 2012, they started helping government to rewrite the Justice for Children legislation, and in 2020 they were supporting the government to introduce operationalize that new legislation. So again, it's those foundations that enable governments to respond fairly quickly. And part of that also was what was fairly clear, that most of the UNICEF country officers talked about high-level advocacy that involved their representatives and wider UN agencies working with, for example, the Supreme Courts in India or Bangladesh in getting agreement about how to ensure that children were protected from COVID in detention. Final slide, thanks, Erin. Okay, so despite this progress, more action is still needed. Many children unnecessarily remain in detention. Certain categories of children, such as children in military detention, those detained in the context of national security concerns, and children in detention due to their alleged association with armed groups, remain least able to access measures made available to other children. And that was very stark in the findings, and it's a particular problem, particular issue in the Middle East and North Africa region. Continued attention is required to ensure the release of these children and that their rights are upheld where necessary, and where necessary they equally benefit from child-friendly and gender-sensitive justice systems and processes. Intensified action is required to address the lack of disaggregated data on child justice, including data on girls and children in immigration detention. Intensified action is also required to accelerate justice sector reforms for children, particularly in countries where those reforms have stalled. And finally, a new and concerning phenomenon requiring closer monitoring is the arrest and detention of children for violating curfews and other restrictions on movements. With that, thank you. I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point later on. And now I'd like to turn over to Vijay Rajamanaraman, who is the UNICEF child protection and justice expert and the global focal point for justice within the UN. Vijay, over to you.
Thanks so much for that, Bruce. And colleagues, the link to the field notes is in the chat. And I'm just about to as well share with you the link to the learning brief, which has just gone up, which is what I'm talking about here today. So Erin, can we move to the first slide, please? Based on the analysis from the field notes, we asked ourselves two key questions. What are we learning about adapting UNICEF programming on access to justice for children in COVID-19? And how is this knowledge being applied to better protect the rights of these boys and girls? Before we dive into trying to answer these questions, two key points to keep in mind. Firstly, we purposefully adopted the position that these lessons are lessons that we are learning. They are not set in stone. And secondly, these lessons are based on the field experiences of UNICEF and our partners. So they are not exhaustive and nor are they complete. We see these rather as a contribution to the lessons being learned by others, including other partners and governments. Next slide, please. So we divided the lessons into three categories, as you see on the screen: options and innovations learning, systems level learning, and strategy related learning. The next slides that I will show are divided into two. On one side, the lessons from the analysis, and on the other side, the translation of those lessons into action, proposed next steps. Due to the time, I have only selected key recommendations to highlight. However, you can read in more detail the lessons and the next steps in the publication, which has been shared in the chat function and which will also be shared in the follow-up email to this webinar. Next slide, please. So let's dive into opportunities and innovations learning. Prior to the pandemic, some countries were using alternatives to detention, but a large number were resistant and remain so. COVID-19 created the need to act quickly for the protection of at-risk groups, including children in detention. And the successes that were achieved imply that achieving broad-scale application of alternatives to detention for children in conflict with the law is actually within reach. Next, as mentioned before, the long-term investment in diversion and alternatives to detention was a key enabler for this result. Countries that had invested in diversion and alternatives prior to COVID did not have large child populations in detention when the pandemic hit, and subsequently weren't scrambling to release children. Another lesson is that more work is needed to ensure that formal post-release programs are an integral part of juvenile justice systems. COVID lockdowns and social distancing requirements created an urgent need for new methods of delivery of court services and professional training. So looking at translating these into action. Invest in country-level learning on the release of children and support countries to develop plans to take that to scale. Support countries to advance restorative justice approaches and child-friendly and gender-responsive diversion and youth offending prevention programs. Support evidence generation in program countries and stronger dissemination of Global South evidence on the efficacy and cost effectiveness of these interventions. Develop global guidelines on post-release programming to be integrated in juvenile justice systems. Evaluate virtual courts and produce guidance to enable scale up or replication for appropriate hearings and processes. And finally, evaluate child justice online professional learning programs, again, to promote scale up or replication where appropriate, and to promote equity, quality, and accessibility in program design. Next slide, please. Moving on to systems learning, systems level learning. Child justice systems are under stress, which has denied or delayed children's access to justice in many places. Firstly, COVID and its related lockdowns and social distancing caused some child justice systems to shut down or to only partially function. Secondly, there is little evidence that access to justice for children programming is a formal part of country-level humanitarian and socioeconomic response planning. And thirdly, the classification of child justice and child protection services as essential services during an emergency varies across countries. However, this stress on child justice systems also has been proving an enabler for wider reforms on children's access to justice. As Bruce mentioned, the lack of child justice data in many countries continues to obstruct further progress, with few countries being able to provide disaggregated data by sex, age, race, ethnicity, or disability. And in terms of the most vulnerable, certain groups of children in detention can remain highly vulnerable and are not being included in the release measures. So children in immigration detention and facilities, those in military detention, those who are detained in the context of national security concerns or due to alleged association with armed groups. At the same time, many countries are also increasing investment in the legal empowerment of children, which is a central component of children's access to justice, as well as reaching the most vulnerable. So in terms of the next steps, articulate a reimagined agenda on children's access to justice in a post-COVID world that contributes to SDG 16, builds on the global study of children deprived of their liberty, and links to existing global child protection agendas. Provide advice to UN country teams on incorporating access to justice for children in UN development cooperation frameworks, humanitarian and socio-economic response planning. Enable countries to improve data collection and strengthen their justice for children information management systems. It's really critical to adopt an increased focus on ending the detention of children in military detention, those detained for national security concerns or alleged association with armed groups or due to their migration status. And finally, develop global guidance on child-friendly legal aid and update existing guidance to internalize non-discrimination as a central tenet of justice systems for children. Next slide. Finally, strategy-related learning, which actually, as you will see, is very UNICEF focused. UNICEF regional offices' investment in access to justice has played a critical role in the provision of timely and demand-driven advice, technical assistance to country officers. UNICEF was able to convene a global interagency task force who jointly developed and published the technical note on COVID-19 and children deprived of their liberty, which became a key tool for advocacy with governments and detaining authorities. In terms of next steps, ensure sufficient regional capacity to support countries to reimagine their approach to children's access to justice. Strengthen the capacity on access to justice for children across UNICEF. And finally, intensify efforts for the inclusion of access to justice for children in COVID-19 response across UNICEF and the wider UN system. In conclusion, the global community is presented with a rare opportunity to increase the scale of diversion and alternatives to detention, restorative justice approaches, the prevention of youth offending, and the legal empowerment of all children, especially those children already within the justice system. These results and these lessons offer government, UNICEF, and partners a chance to rethink approaches and to build on transformative actions for wider justice reforms for children. With that, I will conclude and say thank you. And I will hand over to my colleague, Feni Kakama, who is the Regional Child Protection Specialist at UNICEF Europe and Central Asia Regional Office. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vijaya, and for your insights and the lessons learned. What I will be presenting will be basically a case study focusing on how the technical guide that colleagues have talked about was utilized in our region. So if we move to the next slide, it's just really to remind all of ourselves what were the aims of the technical note. It was basically to provide information and to help country offices to guide their counterparts and recommend and urge for one, instituting a moratorium on new children entering the detention facilities, releasing all children who can be safely released, and protecting the health and well-being of any children who, for one reason or another, would remain in detention. Next slide. So the case study that I'm going to be presenting is based on the responses received from 16 countries. And we really didn't do a comprehensive survey. We just asked the countries after the receipt of the technical guide or the technical note to tell us how they have utilized the note. And then I will also be talking about what we did when we received the technical note and some specific action that were taken by country offices in relation to the note. Next slide. No, one before that. Okay, so based on this case study, the case study provides some insights into how some country offices in our region used the technical note to influence and or contribute to the country's response to the pandemic in relation to children who were deprived of their liberty. So what did we do when we received the technical note? The regional office shared the technical note with all the 23 countries, and we urged them to disseminate it within and among their counterparts, and also actively use it to engage with their governments on the stipulated measures. So what we noted is that in all countries, the note was translated into national or local languages and Russian in some instances. I think the translation was important for our region because English is not a common language, and our experience shows that translated documents into local languages or Russian have better uptake and follow-up from government counterparts. And therefore, we are informed that the translation definitely enhanced the usability and uptake of the technical note and the guidance therein. So let's move to the next slide. So what were some of the key actions and results that the 16 countries reported? I think the most significant was that in the 16 countries that reported or responded, over 1,000 children were released from detention. All the countries mentioned that the technical note was timely and that provided a strong basis of support for the advocacy on the risk of children from detention and also the protection of those children who could not be released. The technical note stipulated on urging countries to stop the intake of new children into detention. In our region, we note that at the time that this brief was compiled, no new children had been admitted into detention. I have the reason to believe that that is still the case because the advocacy for keeping children out of detention during this pandemic still continues in the country offices. Where children were not released, measures were put in place to ensure their health and safety and protection. And several countries responded to the government request, and some on their own initiated the provision of PPEs in places of detention. And that helped in many ways in the short term to fill the gap and ensure that children and their carers in detention places were protected from the spread of the pandemic. It was also reported that the technical note inspired some immediate actions in a number of countries in our region. So I'd like at this moment to give you some specific examples of what kind of actions were inspired in different countries in the region. The technical note informed assessments by the Juvenile Justice Council in Serbia on detention conditions and the impact of COVID-19 restrictions on children and young people in detention facilities. The Council also used the technical note as the basis for a press release informing the public and the professionals that every child in the justice system must be treated in accordance with international standards, including the standards stipulated in the CRC. In Kosovo, the technical note informed a joint advocacy involving the Ombudsperson, a coalition of child protection NGOs, the European Union Office, and UNICEF that called the government for immediate release and protection of juveniles deprived of liberty. In another country, Albania specifically, the note informed and guided prosecutors to avoid using custodial measures against children. In Azerbaijan, the technical note was used by the Ombudsperson to advocate for the rights of children in detention, contributing to the release of 47 children from detention in the different detention facilities. And similarly, in Bulgaria, the Ombudsperson used a technical note to recommend to the Ministry of Education on safety measures for children in the correctional institutions. I think a good example that I can also be cited that was reported on is from Ukraine. So Ukraine is the only country in the region that reported on measures to ensure gender responsive approaches in addressing the COVID-19, including the needs of children whose mothers were deprived of liberty. And therefore they started to develop a comprehensive program for mothers and pregnant women in detention that entirely included COVID prevention activities, early childhood development activities, positive parenting, and measures for preventing violence against children. And another good example that can be cited, although there are also many examples, as you'll see in the case study, is North Macedonia, where UNICEF supported the Ministry of Health to develop safety protocols for correctional facilities, focusing on the conditions needed to guarantee the protection of children during the pandemic. Perhaps two more specific examples are drawn from two countries in Central Asia, one in Tajikistan, where parasocial workers continue to work with children remotely, and also in Kyrgyzstan, where children detention could be visited by their parents and relatives if they had recent certification of COVID-19 negative test results. In Turkey, the technical note was used as a training resource where it was used to conduct training with the Union of Turkish Bar Associations and encouraging lawyers to apply to the courts for immediate release of children under pretrial detention. Next slide. So just citing two takeaways that are really not different from what colleagues have already mentioned. One of them is that the technical notes aligned very well with the needs of national governments and provided further guidance and impetus to their efforts as they sought to respond to COVID-19 and the situation of children deprived of their liberty. And I think we believe that the COVID-19 crisis may present a unique opportunity for governments in our region to continue and accelerate the promotion of alternatives to detention, and perhaps consider releasing even more children from places of detention as a way of preventing the spread of infection. And as our colleagues have already mentioned, this will build on the reforms over the years in our region, which led to a significant decrease of children in detention, and also galvanizing government efforts to alternative measures for dealing with children who come into the justice system as offenders. So colleagues, this is what I really can share as of now due to the time that is available, but definitely you will be able to get the details in the case study that will give you those kind of insights. And as the region, we feel the technical guide was very important and it illustrates that timely guidance of the nature can make a difference and make important contributions to whatever interventions you want to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Feni, for that case study and sharing the experience from the region. Colleagues, we're now going to move into a Q&A session, and I see that you have been populating the Q&A with some questions, and some of them we have tried to answer as we've gone, and we may revisit them now for the benefit of other people. But can I encourage you to keep putting questions into the Q&A? We're going to move through them. And I will moderate and pass them to different panelists to have their responses. And to the panelists as well, if I don't pass to you, but you would like to contribute, please do so. So one question that we had, and I might start here with Bruce. Bruce, Hamish from TDH Lausanne asks whether the analysis considered children in Nauru as children in detention, and do your findings apply to that context, or is it a different type of context, unique situation?
Thank you, Vijay and Hamish, for the question. No, Hamish, the report did indeed look at the situation of children in immigration detention and such facilities. That was a very important part of the rapid analysis. In terms of Nauru, we didn't have any specific data. And what we did, most of the data I think we had about children in detention primarily come out of the refugee crisis in Europe and Central Asia. We've got quite a bit of data about what different agencies were doing to get children out of detention. We had some data from South and Latin America, but unfortunately, I don't recall us having data from Nauru. Vijay, back to you. Do you have any light to shed on this?
No, thanks, Bruce. Any of the other panelists, feel free to unmute yourself, or I'll keep going forward. From South America region, we have Esther Ruiz. Esther would like to know whether there was an analysis of the situation of children once they had been released. Did they have any kind of support once released? Great question, Esther. Bruce, do you want to start with that, and I can also add to it?
Okay, thanks, Vijay. Esther, we don't have any data in terms of the rapid analysis on what happened to children once they were released. So there's no data there. But what we do know is that most countries were trying to ensure there was some post-release support wrapped around the children coming out of detention. Part of that was through the work that UNICEF country office had been doing to strengthen the overall social welfare system, child protection system, so to ensure that kids who were coming out were got some sort of support from social workers. In other countries, though, people were just sort of building the plane as they were flying it. There seemed, from what I recall, there was a very high level of awareness of the need to ensure that children come out of detention were supported primarily for two reasons. One, you need to ensure that the child was safe. Yeah. And secondly, there's also a concern we know globally that when children are released from detention, some people argue that that's a process that's being soft on crime, soft on juvenile crime. What needs to happen is that children need to be kept in detention and they need to be punished. The global evidence is fairly clear that that sort of approach does not work in reducing juvenile offending and does not make societies safer. But I think there's awareness across UNICEF country offices that that's a sensitivity that needs to be managed. So not only did you have real efforts to ensure the kids got some sort of post-release support, there was an awareness of the sensitivities around this, because all you need in one or two countries is cases where a child has been released and someone has been harmed, and then that politicizes what should be fundamentally a humanitarian response. Vijay?
Thanks, Bruce. And just to add to what Bruce had said, Esther and colleagues, in the field notes, there are a few country examples where the countries did invest heavily in post-release support. So you can look at that, and as a result of this and what Bruce has been saying, you know, the need for further support towards post-release planning and programming has been identified as a very big need at the global level, and we'll be looking to how we can fill that need in time to come. Would anyone else like to add to that, or I am happy to move on? Claudia, we have a couple of questions to you about the presentation that you made on the socioeconomics study. Two of them you have answered, and then there's one from Marcus Angula, where he's asking, were the numbers of children released compared to the number of children released in 2019? I wonder if you could answer that, Claudia. And perhaps, Claudia, could you also just briefly touch on the other two questions that you've answered in text, just to share with the audience? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Vijay, and thanks, Marcus and others, for this question. What the survey asked about was whether the country had released children from detention. So we did not compare directly the number of children released in 2019 with the number of children released in 2020. So the determination of whether or not there has been release since the beginning of the pandemic was left to the respondent of the survey at the country office level. So it was not an analysis of baseline data, for instance, from 2019 versus 2020. Angela has a good point. In countries where UNICEF doubted the veracity of the data they were working with, how was that reflected in the data presentation of the report? So what we did, we asked our country office to elaborate on their assessment and what their assessment was made of, so was based on, meaning whether this was based on anecdotal evidence versus official records produced by government, etc. Now, this allowed us to understand the source of information that our country office used to provide information to us through the survey. However, we know very well that the quality and the coverage of the data on justice for children, and particularly on the number of children in detention, remains weak in most of the countries across the world. And this gave me an opportunity to mention a couple of upcoming projects and releases that we have, including some of them that will be featured in a next webinar. So we have conducted an in-depth assessment of the availability and quality of justice for children data. And we particularly look at a subset of countries where we did an in-depth assessment of the systems, of the administrative data systems for producing these estimates, and what are the bottlenecks that exist in the subset of countries when it comes to having a good and reliable estimate on the number of children in detention, among many other indicators that we will look at. And of course, the quality of the records were found to be extremely poor, but in light of different bottlenecks that might exist, whether it's at the level of the compilation of the information or at the level of the, for instance, analysis of the data. And in response to the poor quality that was found overall, and also in response to the bottlenecks that were identified, we have developed a toolkit for self-assessment that countries can use to really understand the state of their administrative data systems when it comes to the ability of such systems to produce reliable and solid data on a number of different indicators related to justice for children. So we're going to go more in depth into the data-related issues, but I definitely acknowledge the fact that these data remain poor, not only in terms of coverage, so meaning the number of countries for which we have the data, the coverage of this information at the country level, but also in terms of really quality of the underlying data systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Colleagues, we have quite a few questions on virtual courts. So I'm going to group them all as one and then hand over to the panelists who feel to answer the questions more generally. So firstly, from Kudzai in Zimbabwe mentions that Zimbabwe is exploring the possibility of virtual courts and that there is a positive uptake from the government, and that they are keen to learn about from colleagues in the region and globally who have supported such virtual courts, because they are realizing that there is a lot of equipment and IT techniques required to set up a functional system. We heard from Gökten in Turkey, where Turkey has introduced an e-hearing system recently, but there are fundamental objections to this virtual methodology, particularly from some judges and defendants, as they say it may put some of the fair trial principles at risk. And Gökten asks, are there any good examples or guidance being developed in that sense? Similarly, Joshua Dunkov says that it seems that there's an assumption that the movement to remote court sessions is a positive innovation and that it potentially speeds up processes. Were there any data or questions on the potential negative effects of remote court sessions in terms of reduced due process, ability to understand procedure, access and ability to speak to counsel and paralegals? And finally, from Quorum International, a similar question: can children have a fair trial in a virtual court, and what safeguards are needed to ensure that? So perhaps, Bruce, you could perhaps start off with some of answering the part about what the rapid analysis contemplated in respect of these these virtual courts, and then I can add to some of the more substantive questions as well, and any other panelists feel free to jump in. Over to you, Bruce, to start.
Great, thank you, Vijay, and Joshua, like fantastic question. In terms of the rapid analysis, no, we didn't have time to that sort of level of deep dive to unpack that. I think you're right. There is an assumption that the movement to remote court sessions is a positive one, but that assumption has a number of caveats. So what we know is that many countries have been moving towards virtual courts prior to COVID. I think the UK legal system is really pushing that forward. COVID has just accelerated this process. What we said in the report was, yes, this seems positive, but what we need to do is understand it better. So it's exactly what you're saying. We need to understand what are the benefits of this, and also what are the risks? What are the contexts in which virtual courts can be a benefit? In what sense do they deny justice? And so the keys of thinking around all this is UNICEF needs to do much more work to understand this phenomenon more. Vijay, back to you.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Yes, and certainly within the field notes, you will see that there are some descriptions of those countries that have implemented virtual courts for children's courts or juvenile courts. And I'd encourage you as well that we will be hosting 2 more webinars following this webinar, where we will be doing country deep dives with selected countries from the field notes, from the analysis. And in one of those webinars, we will definitely be including a country that has had the experience of introducing virtual courts, to hear from them specifically about their experience. But just to reiterate what Bruce has said, and the questions and points that have been made by colleagues, certainly it is an innovation, and there are many positive aspects to it. However, for UNICEF, we see that this is a moment to evaluate these courts and to see how they impact children's access to justice. And certainly with any innovation, there are always teething problems, there are always questions around whether it works, and how does it work, and who does it work for. So we're keen to look more deeply into this in the coming time to understand it more deeply, and then potentially develop some guidance, some global guidance or recommendations about these processes. So with that, I think Feni looks like he wants to come in on this question.
I just really wanted to say that some of those questions are really important, and kind of begin like helping us to prepare for how virtual courts, which might actually become a reality sometime, can be best dealt with. I know in our region, some countries, of course, did a lot of things differently, trying to reach out to children remotely. And for some of the cases that were prioritized, hearings were kind of done virtually. But I think the questions that are being raised are important to be able to see how that mechanism works. And if it's going to be something that's going to be widely used, then we need to see how that can be supported to ensure that some of the issues and concerns are addressed and to gain the kind of traction that it requires. So I think something and think about, and as Vijay mentioned, that could inform the kind of guidance that can be provided in the future. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Feni. And just to add, our colleague Anna Giudici from UNODC has mentioned in the question and answer that ORLSI and UNITAR have worked on a guidance document on e-justice, which should be out sometime soon. She's provided the link in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Anna. It does include some references to children and juvenile justice. So that could be a useful tool or document for colleagues to also access. Continuing on using this virtual questions to segue, there is a question that's come in from Guillaume Landry, where he's asking, has there been evidence of how the social workforce has also used virtual means to continue their work with children as part of the justice system? A great question, Guillaume. And also linked to that, let me just also raise a question from Ethiopia, Nalamayu. I apologize for that pronunciation. In contexts like Ethiopia, where a case management system is lacking, including social welfare workforce, supporting and ensuring successful reintegration of children with families and communities has also been very challenging. So again, that element of the social service workforce, but this question from Ethiopia more around the reintegration aspect. So Bruce, did you want to touch that, Feni, or anyone else?
In terms of the first question around the social workers, there wasn't a lot of data or knowledge or information to come through in terms of this rapid analysis, but then in parallel to this process, there's a separate rapid analysis that looked at how UNICEF's program for violence against children is evolving and adapting to the situation of COVID. And within that rapid analysis, there's quite a bit of information about the role of social workers, case management, how they've moved online and what social workers are doing, and what and how case management are either being delivered online or through texting or using shared platforms such as WhatsApp. So in terms of justice for children, no, we don't have any information from this process, but from the violence against children work, there should be some rich information available on that. But again, with the violence against children piece, the assumption is, yes, this is a good thing, but we need to know more. We need to know how to ensure that children's rights are protected through this process. In what sort of situations can you do social work and case management online? But yes, in terms of the violence against children work, there's quite a bit of that was documented through that analysis. In terms of this, the example in Ethiopia, I think that's it's really important. And what you're saying is just represented in so many countries. What became clear from the rapid analysis is we need to better articulate what is justice for children. What are the components of a child, of a justice for children system or a juvenile justice system? And the idea of post-release support needs to be moved much stronger into that discussion around systems, so that case management becomes an essential part of juvenile justice and not a secondary part that might happen later on or in countries that have more resources or more time to look at that. Vijay, back to you.
Thanks so much, Bruce. And I'm going to, colleagues, we are running short of time, and I do want to give enough time to our next speaker who's going to close us out, and that is Kirsten DiMartino, who is the Senior Advisor on Social Welfare and Justice Systems and child protection at headquarters in New York. But before I hand over to Kirsten, I think picking up on Bruce's point, and just one last question, which I'll throw you as a curveball to perhaps you can include some comment in your final statement, is a great question from Anne Skelton, where Anne says, we need to increase our conceptualization of access to justice more broadly, beyond children already in the justice system. We need to move towards an understanding that using the law and courts can be a tool to achieve all children's rights and provide them with remedies. Anne asked whether we can tell what UNICEF is doing to expand the understanding and build that into the programming at country level. And it's a very, very broad question, and we could be here for days talking about the work. But certainly, let me just kick off and then hand over to Kirsten, is that these two pieces of work really, while it was focused on children being released from detention, it was also and the continuation of court services for children. We really do are trying to take a much broader view of what access to justice for children includes, and use this work that is very well known to UNICEF as an entry point to children's access to justice, and how these systems, legal systems, can be used to help children access justice and gain remedies for any rights violation that they may face. So with that, I will stop and I will hand over to Kirsten to close us off. So thank you so much, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Vijay, and really a lot of wonderful ideas going through my head. I will try to be brief. I know we are short on time. First of all, I would really like to thank Claudia, Bruce, Vijay, and Feni for the wonderful presentation today, and also for pulling all the rich information that we gathered from the field. And in this respect, I would really, really like to thank very much all the colleagues at the country, regional level, and all our partners and stakeholders with whom we work, who contributed to these publications and helped us to gather this very important evidence and information that was presented today. But most of all, I really would like to thank colleagues and all those working in the field, working on the ground with children in the justice system every day, for the incredible work that they have done during an incredibly difficult period of time during the COVID pandemic, to ensure that children could continue to have access to justice, and most importantly, to ensure that children could be released from detention. I think that I can humbly say that in the 20 years I've worked with UNICEF, I have not witnessed so many children being released from detention in such a short period of time. So thank you very much. I would like to just start by reminding everybody that as the pandemic hit, of course, UNICEF, immediately, initiated and tried to lead efforts to respond, to ensure that children could continue to have access to justice, and especially to address the situation of many, many children in detention, ensure that they could be safe from the risks of COVID-19. What we did is we convened an interagency effort, which led to the publication of technical guidance on children in detention and COVID-19, and that was followed very shortly afterwards by a call from our executive director Henrietta Fore for the release of all children who could be safely, the immediate release of all children who could be safely released. and a moratorium on new entries, as well as ensuring that all children who remained in detention would be adequately protected. And many, many countries followed suit, and many of you reacted and responded. And as a result of that, even though we witnessed the devastating impact that COVID-19 had on many, we also created tremendous opportunities that led to many children being released. As we heard, we know that at least, and this is only the data we could verify and obtain, 11,600 children were released from detention in at least 37 countries. But we know from other sources that many more were probably released in other countries as well. So what do we do with these opportunities? How do we move forward? How do we take this devastating situation to create something better and bigger and lead to longer reforms for justice for children? And there are a few ideas that have come up in today's presentations and discussions that I would like in particular to highlight. The first one is children were released. They were released. So the question begs itself, if these children could be safely released now, why were they in detention in the first place? So are we really applying detention as a measure of last resort? Are we really fully utilizing the options of restorative justice and alternatives to detention that we could be utilizing? So this is one of the key questions that I've asked myself all the time throughout this pandemic. Another important question, I think many of you have raised it, is what is happening to the children we are releasing? You know, it is extremely important that we ensure that they are supported, that those very systems, the child protection system, the social welfare system, and other systems that probably failed them in the first place and led to them being in contact with the law and entering the justice system, that those systems are reinforced, that we have the social service workforce in place as an essential workforce throughout the pandemic to ensure that the reintegration of these children following release is successful. And I think several of you mentioned that there are risks, there are real risks with reoffending. There are risks that the public perception will turn against us, that they will say, you see, you released them and now they have reoffended. So what are we doing about this? And certainly this year we will be looking to working with all of you to collect good example, good evidence from the field of what is working in terms of post-release, and also to developing more tools and guidance in this respect so we can reinforce our support. The other point that came up throughout is also innovation and technology. There was a lot of interest around the virtual courts, the online learning. How can we expand the use of this technology and innovations? How can we go to scale? But at the same time, what are the risks? You know, are we really reaching all children? Are we reaching the most vulnerable? Is there a digital divide that will prevent certain children from accessing justice if we move to technology? And of course, the most important question, what safeguards do we need to put in place? And can we ensure that children really will get a fair trial through the use of these innovative approaches? So again, balancing the opportunities with the potential risks and putting in place the appropriate frameworks and safeguards to address these. Another key issue that is coming out very, very clearly, an issue that we really need to address, is about children's legal empowerment. I think last year the world witnessed how much children were at the forefront of protests with regard to climate change, with regard to social justice, with regard to systemic racism and discrimination, and also with regard to their daily lives when they are in contact with the law. How do we ensure that this is not a tokenistic approach, that we really provide children with legal empowerment, that not only they have legal aid and representation, but they have legal education, and that we hear the lived experiences of those children and young people who have gone through the justice system, who know how it really works and how it really impacts them, and that we give appropriate time to listen to them. Another key point is, of course, the data and the data collection, interpreting that data, analyzing that data. We really call on all of you to initiate processes and dialogue and facilitate processes at the national level to bring all the relevant actors together to start collecting this data on justice for children. Because without that data, we cannot effectively influence change and influence policy decisions. So really a top priority. And as Claudia has mentioned, we will be having we will have our fourth webinar in this series of webinars will be dedicated to looking at to two publications that DNA has published around achieving justice for children, a review of innovative data initiatives around the world, and another one around strengthening administrative data on justice for children and a quick assessment tool. So we will be presenting that in our fourth webinar on the 3rd of March, and you will all, of course, receive the invitation also for that. So based on some of those examples, of course, there's a lot more we could be doing. I really encourage you to continue working, moving forward, pushing, driving the reform processes at the country level, taking the opportunities presented by COVID-19 and really hopefully advancing that agenda. Finally, I want to say that as UNICEF, in parallel to collecting all the evidence and lessons learned from the field, we have been investing a lot of time on a reimagined think piece. We will be launching later this year a document that looks at how we can reimagine access to justice for children moving forward. And it will contain some of the key action points that UNICEF will be calling for in order to advance progress in this area of work, to accelerate the access to justice agenda, to ensure no one is left behind, and really, make significant progress to achieving the SDG goals. And in this context, of course, responding also to Anne Skelton's question, how do we situate access to justice? How access to justice is not relevant only for children who are in contact with the law, who are in contact with the justice system, but how access to justice can really help children claim their rights across the board and ensure that they can seek redress and remedies for all child rights violations. So how fundamental it really is to protecting children's rights across the board. So I think I will leave it at that, to thank everybody for the tremendous effort. I'm extremely excited to see all these pieces moving forward, and I hope we can keep this momentum and we can really drive this agenda and really make a real difference for the children who are today living in very difficult circumstances, and also those children who are still in detention. I hope that countries where colleagues from countries who are listening today, where perhaps this has not yet happened, will find these tools and information useful to convince their colleagues and their government counterparts to really prioritize the release of children from detention and support them. And so I will leave it at that with a big thank you. And then I know that Vijay reminded me to remind you all that this is just the first of four webinar series. So there will be another 2 webinar series coming up, one on the 17th of February and one on the 24th of February, where we will be doing more deep dives into some of the country case studies. You will receive an invitation for that soon. Please join and share your experiences. And then, of course, as I already mentioned, there will be the 4th webinar series on the 30th of March, where we will be sharing with you some of the tools that you can be using from DNA to collect better evidence and data on children in the justice system. So thank you very much to everybody, and thank you for your participation and the tremendous work that is being done.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And with that, I'm pleased to bring today's webinar to a close. Colleagues, wherever you are, have a great day, a great afternoon, or a great evening, or a great early morning if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, like Bruce and myself. Thank you once again, and we will be in touch with the details of the next webinar. Take care.